You're in the middle of an important task when your phone buzzes. It's that friend again, the one who always seems to be in crisis. And even though you're exhausted and you have your own deadlines, you begin to start to feel that familiar surge of anxiety. And before you know it, you've dropped everything to help them again. Later, you're lying awake at 2 a.m., resentful and drained, wondering why you always put everyone else's needs before your own. If that scenario feels painfully familiar, you might be caught in the codependency cycle, a pattern where your sense of self-worth and safety is really tangled up in other people's needs, emotions, and approval. Today, we're going to be breaking down how childhood trauma creates these codependent patterns, the 3 most common codependency traps, and a practical 4-step framework for establishing healthy boundaries, complete with actual scripts that you can use in difficult conversations. Because contrary to what your trauma might have taught you, having boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It makes you whole. Before we dive in, I wanted to tell you why I'm so passionate about this topic. I started this channel because childhood trauma really has been stunting me in every area of my life. And I really didn't understand why until I got my complex post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis in 2024. Suddenly, everything clicked. The people pleasing, the emotional caretaking, and feeling like I was constantly performing instead of just being. Now, I do have training in breath work, somatic healing, and shadow work, as well as Reiki, but I'm not here to be your guru or to tell you to manifest your way out of trauma with expensive crystals. Although, I do love the crystals. I'm here as your loving, forward friend who's doing this work in real time and wants to share what's actually helping me break these cycles for myself and my family. The boundary framework I'm sharing today isn't theory. It's what I'm using right now to stop abandoning myself and to start showing up as a whole person. And if it can work for a perimenopausal mom who's used to saying yes to everything, it can work for you. By the end of this video, you'll have first a clear understanding of how childhood trauma creates codependent patterns in your nervous system and your relationships. Second, the ability to identify the 3 common codependency traps that you might be falling into. And third, a practical 4-step framework for establishing healthy boundaries with actual scripts that you can adapt for your specific situation. And finally, the techniques to manage the guilt and anxiety that often arise when you start setting boundaries after a lifetime of people pleasing. This isn't about becoming selfish or cutting people off. It's about creating relationships where both people's needs matter, including yours. It's about breaking the exhausting cycle of resentment and burnout that comes from constantly overextending yourself. And most importantly, it's about reclaiming parts of yourself that got lost along the way, your preferences, your voice, the right to exist as more than just what you can do for others. Here's what most people misunderstand about codependency. These patterns aren't character flaws or signs of weakness. They're sophisticated survival adaptations your brain developed in response to childhood trauma, emotional neglect. When your early environment made it unsafe to have needs, express feelings, or set boundaries, your developing brain adapted. You learned to focus outward instead of inward, to attune to other people's needs and emotions while disconnecting from your own, and to derive safety from caretaking rather than being cared for. This revelation changes everything. You are not broken or weak from struggling with boundaries and people pleasing. You're carrying the imprint of trauma in your nervous system and relationship patterns. And once you understand this, you can begin the work of rewiring these patterns and reclaiming your right to have needs, feelings, and boundaries. Let's explore the 3 most common codependency traps that trauma survivors fall into. As I describe each one, notice which patterns feel most familiar to you. Trap number 1. People pleasing. This is the compulsive need to say yes even when you want to say no. It shows up as a difficulty refusing requests, overcommitting, and even prioritizing others' comfort over your own needs. People pleasing develops when a child learns that safety or connection depends on compliance. Maybe you had a parent with unpredictable anger, or perhaps your role in the family was to keep the peace. Your developing brain learned, if I say no or I assert my needs, I risk rejection, abandonment, and even danger. The impact in adulthood is chronic exhaustion, resentment, and a disconnection from your authentic desires. You might find yourself agreeing to things and immediately regretting it, or feeling intense anxiety at the mere thought of disappointing others. Trap number 2, emotional caretaking. This is where you feel responsible for other people's emotions and well-being. You might pride yourself on being the person everyone turns to with their problems, but secretly feels drained by constantly absorbing other people's emotional crap. Emotional caretaking often develops when a child has to manage a person's emotional needs. Perhaps you had a parent, like myself, who leaned on you for emotional support, or whose moods just dominated the household. You learn to be hypervigilant to emotional cues and to prioritize others' emotional comfort over your own. In adulthood, this shows up as difficulty setting boundaries. You might feel other people's feelings as if they were your own, or you might take on the responsibility for fixing others' problems. In adulthood, this shows up as difficulty setting emotional boundaries. Trap number 3, self-abandonment. For me, this was the most painful trap, where you constantly betray yourself to maintain relationships. You might ignore your intuition, tolerate disrespect or mistreatment, or lose touch with your own preferences and desires. Self-abandonment develops when a child's authentic self is constantly invalidated or rejected. Maybe expressing certain emotions wasn't allowed, or perhaps your boundaries were routinely violated. You learned that survival meant disconnecting from your authentic needs and feelings. In adulthood, this manifests as difficulty identifying what exactly it is that you want, chronic self-doubt, and relationships where your needs are constantly coming last. You might even have a strong inner critic that echoes messages from childhood about being too much or too needy. These 3 traps, people pleasing, emotional caretaking, and self-abandonment, often overlap and reinforce one another. The common thread is that your worth becomes tied to what you do for others rather than your inherent value as a person. There's a big difference. Now that we understand how codependency develops, let's talk about how to break the cycle through healthy boundaries. I'm going to share with you a practical 4-step framework that has helped me and other trauma survivors that I have worked with reclaim their autonomy and transform their relationships. Step 1, identify your true needs and limits. And I know this sounds simple, but for many trauma survivors, it's actually the hardest part. I know it was for me. When you've spent years disconnected from your own needs, you might not even know what they are. I want you to start paying attention to resentment, because it often is a signal that a boundary has been crossed. Notice when you feel that familiar burn of resentment, I want you to ask yourself, what need of mine isn't being met? What limit is being pushed? Another approach is to practice the pause. When someone makes a request, instead of automatically saying yes, say, let me think about it and get back to you. This creates the space to check in with your authentic feelings. Step 2, give yourself permission to have boundaries. This is the internal work that makes external boundary setting possible. Many trauma survivors carry deep beliefs that having needs or setting boundaries is selfish, dangerous, or will lead to abandonment. Before you can effectively communicate boundaries to others, you need to address these internal objections. Try this permission statement. I have the right to determine what I do with my time, my energy, and resources. Having boundaries doesn't make me selfish. It makes me responsible for my well-being. Now, I'm aware you might need to repeat this to yourself 1,000 times. I know I did before I started believing it. And that is okay. You're rewiring your neural pathways that were established early in life. Step 3, use the boundary communication formula. This is where many people get stuck. They know that they need a boundary, but they don't know how to express it effectively. Here's a simple formula that works in most situations. Acknowledge the request or situation, state your boundary clearly, and directly offer an alternative if appropriate. End with confidence, no apology. For example, instead of saying, "I'm so sorry, I can't help you this weekend. I'm such a terrible friend," and then list off a million excuses as to why you can't help them move, you might say, "I understand that you need help moving this weekend. I'm not available to help you move, but I'd be happy to drop off dinner to you that evening. And I really hope that the move goes smooth." Notice there's no over explaining, no excessive apologizing, and no invitation for negotiation. The boundary is stated as a simple fact, not a topic for debate. Step 4, develop a plan for managing boundary violations. Even with perfect communication, some people will test or ignore your boundaries. It happens to me all the time. This is especially true if you're in a relationship with established patterns of codependency, or maybe you've left a relationship where there was those patterns of codependency. When someone pushes back against your boundary, remember that their reaction is not your responsibility. Your job is to maintain your boundary with consistency and calm. You might use phrases like, "I understand you're disappointed, but my decision stands," or "I've thought carefully about this and this is what works for me," or "I need you to respect my decision even if you don't agree with it." And if someone consistently violates your boundaries despite clear communication, that's important information about the health of that relationship. Sometimes the most powerful boundary is creating distance from relationships that constantly disrespect your limits. Let's look at some common scenarios where boundaries are challenging with specific scripts that you can adapt to your own situations. Scenario 1, you have a friend that always dumps their emotional crises on you, often late at night or when you're busy. Here's your script. Get a pen. "I care about you a lot and I want to be supportive, but I'm not available for crisis calls after 9 p.m. I can talk during these specific times, or I can help you find resources for support outside of those hours." This boundary acknowledges the relationship while setting clear limits on your availability. And it also offers an alternative that still provides support within your boundaries. Scenario 2, the family member who makes intrusive comments about your life, choices, body, relationships. "I know you care about me, but comments about my weight, my relationship, or my career choices are off limits. I won't be engaging in these conversations anymore. I'd love to talk to you about other things like plants." This boundary clearly names the specific behavior that's unacceptable and redirects to more positive interactions. If they continue despite the boundary, you might add, "If you continue to make these comments, I will need to end our visit, our call," you fill in the blank. Scenario 3, the colleague who constantly interrupts you or takes credit for your ideas. "I noticed that I was interrupted while I was sharing my perspective. I'd like to finish my thought before moving on." Or, "That idea actually came from the proposal that I shared last week. I'm so glad that you see value in it." The thing about workplace settings is that workplace boundaries often require more diplomacy, but can still be clear and direct. The key is addressing the behavior immediately and matter of factly without any emotional charge. I know, easier said than done. Scenario 4, the partner who expects you to be constantly available or emotionally responsible for them. Who here has been guilty of that? So here is an example of a script that you can use. "I care deeply about you, but I cannot be your only source of emotional support. I need time for myself and for my own well-being. Let's talk about how we can both get our needs met in this relationship." Relationship boundaries can be especially challenging because they often trigger attachment fears. Remember that healthy relationships require two whole people, not one person sacrificing themselves for the other. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the guilt and the anxiety that often arise when you start setting boundaries after a lifetime of people pleasing. First, understand that this guilt is normal and expected. Your nervous system has been wired to equate boundaries with danger. And so when you start setting limits, your brain might interpret this as a threat to your safety or relationships. The guilt that you feel isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're actually doing something different. Your nervous system needs time to learn that boundaries actually create safety, not threaten it. Here are 3 techniques to manage boundary guilt. First, practice the boundary mantra. My boundaries protect my ability to love and care for others sustainably. Remind yourself that boundaries aren't walls, they're gates that allow healthy connection while protecting your well-being. Second, use the 4-7-8 breathing technique when you feel boundary anxiety. I'm going to be doing a video on this in the future, but it's really simple. You're going to breathe in for 4 counts, hold it for 7, and exhale for 8. This activates your parasympathetic nervous system and helps you stay grounded in your decisions. Third, I want you to practice self-compassion. I want you to speak to yourself the way that you would speak to a dear friend who was learning to set boundaries. You're not being selfish. You're learning to care for yourself in the ways that you've cared for others. Breaking the codependency cycle isn't about becoming cold or selfish. It's about creating space for authentic, mutual relationships where both people's needs matter. I want you to start small. Choose one relationship. You can practice setting a minor boundary. Expect pushback, especially from people who have benefited from your lack of boundaries. This doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that you're changing a dynamic that wasn't serving you. One of the things that has helped me is by keeping a boundary journal. What you're going to do is you're going to notice what triggers your people-pleasing responses and what boundaries feel most challenging to you and how you feel before and after setting those limits. This awareness will help you continue growing in this area. Remember, you're not responsible for other people's emotions, reactions, or well-being. You're responsible for your own choices, boundaries, and healing. This shift in responsibility is often the key to breaking free from codependent patterns. If this video resonated with you, you're not alone in this journey. Breaking codependent patterns is some of the most challenging and rewarding work that you can do for yourself and your relationships. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which of the 3 codependency traps felt most familiar to you? And what is one boundary that you can get ready to practice this week? Your sharing helps create a community where we can all learn and grow together. If you're ready to dive deep into trauma healing and boundary work, just make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're building a community of people who are committed to breaking cycles and creating healthier relationships. For more practical tools, please check the links below. Remember, you deserve relationships where your needs matter. You deserve to take up space. You deserve to exist more than what you can do for others. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's an act of self-love that creates space for authentic connection. Until next time, be gentle with yourself as you practice these new skills. Healing isn't linear. Every small step towards honoring your needs is worth celebrating. You've got this.